The Feudal Future Podcast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Feudal Future Podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And you know, Joel, our podcast is all about unintended consequences. And today we're going to tackle what seems to be one of the largest unintended consequences of the world, which is that nobody can afford to live where they would really like to live. Housing policy, which is arguably one of the big foci of governments, has seemed to have yielded a world where nobody can afford to live. And to help us talk about that, we have got three of the world's foremost housing policy analysts with us today. Ross Elliott is with us. He's Director of Suburban Futures at Queensland University in Australia. Peter Holle, who is CEO of the Frontier Centre for Public Policy in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And our dear friend, Wendell Cox, who's Senior Fellow here at the Chapman University Center for Demographics and Policy and Principal in Demographia. Demographia is the firm that tracks housing prices around the world. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
Joel, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I will start off with, obviously, we have been amazed by the reaction to Wendell's report. We're up into the hundreds of millions of views. What's going on is housing. Has housing always been a big issue, or is there something that's changed that's now made it a tremendous focus of public attention?
Well, it's certainly, things have changed, but it's been a long time. I mean, it's on everybody's lips. But you know, the problem that has occurred is in all three of the countries that we're talking that are represented in this call today, and a few others, I should say almost all others, there's been a huge escalation of housing prices relative to incomes. The middle class can no longer afford middle class housing. If you go back anywhere from 30 to 50 years, what you find is that in virtually every market in each of these three countries had a price to income ratio or a median multiple of about 3 or a little bit less than that. At this point, we have Sydney at about 14. That is 3 times up relative to costs, relative incomes. The U.S. top market's about 12. The Canadian top market's about 13. People can't afford the housing. And the problem with housing is that it really drives the cost of living. I mean, you think about the inflation, two and 3 times inflation that's occurred in housing relative to incomes. There is no other part of the economy where you can find numbers like that. So that's it. And the sort of the related things of young people not being able to get decent housing, and even to some extent the terrible homeless problem that is really centered on the American West and is growing, I think, in a lot of places.
Well, we try to fix this, right? Governments around the world have tried to fix this problem. Peter and Ross, what's going wrong? Why is nothing working?
Well, didn't Ronald Reagan once say, you know, the most dangerous words in the English language are, we're from the government, we're here to help. And I think that's what's happened with housing policy. Marshall, I don't mean to correct you too, but I'm not part of the University of Queensland. I graduated from there, but Suburban Futures, just for the record, is a fully independent, not-for-profit research group. So what went wrong? Well, look, I think there's just been generations now of misapplied public policy, a lot of which, and Wendell, you know, this is your theme, is built around objections to sprawl. Look, a lot of those were legitimate, but in trying to control and direct the market, we've added layer upon layer upon layer of regulation and micro-regulation that has done nothing but add to cost. And at the same time as we've made supply more difficult and costly to deliver, we've accelerated demand, particularly in this country. It's based on immigration because our natural rate of births over deaths is almost zero. But we've had record levels of immigration, and that has led to chronic housing shortages. And I think, Peter, that's probably the same story as Canada.
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, because Canada, as you know, as a percentage of the population, is many more immigrants than the United States.
Well, of course, Canada, second largest country in the world. There's no shortage of land here, but again, Toronto and Vancouver are among the worst performers in the index. And again, it ties back to overregulation, as Ross says, land use rules. And of course, the Toronto area has a green belt. And in spite of having a conservative government there, it looked like they were going to ease up on it, but no, they backed off. Very powerful lobbies that, of course, want to keep the status quo. And, I think there's a great statistic in the report comparing Winnipeg with Toronto and Vancouver. The price of a house, the building costs are relatively similar, but the price of land in Toronto and Vancouver it's 9 times higher in Toronto and 12 times higher in Vancouver. So it is a land issue, and it's, why are we restricting land? It gets back to zoning and land use regulations and green belts.
So this is the argument that's starting to emerge is kind of the inner libertarian in
Right.
people must be coming out and going, oh, well, let's just get the government the hell out of this completely. Doesn't strike me that that's likely to happen.
I doubt it.
What are the good things and what are the bad things about public policy that you think are either contributing to the problem and could potentially be fixed if we were to change policies?
Well, you've got to start with recognizing that we do not have a situation where there was a problem that government came in to fix and screwed it up. We had a situation where the markets were working in every one of the countries we're dealing with. The planners, however, felt like we were using too much land. And so in Australia, with an urbanization rate of 0.25% of its land, 99.75% of the land in Australia is not urban. In Canada, in the agricultural belt, 97% of the land is not urban, and in the United States, similar number. And the planners wanted to stop this terrible thing called sprawl. Well, that's fine, and I wouldn't have any objection to that if they had managed to do it in a way that they didn't mess up housing affordability and the standard of living. But the fact is they did that, and I'll tell you, I think very strongly that sprawl is a lot better than poverty, because what we have is a situation where families cannot afford the housing their parents did, and they're forced, to live in apartments that are too small. Some are even forced into public housing, where in some cities in the US and Canada, there are 10-year waits on the waiting list. We are increasing poverty here, and it is a real shame.
Well, but of course, the problem is there any political pushback in any of the countries? Are people saying the government is making things worse? I mean, I hear from young people all the time that they can't afford to buy a house. We just did a report on Latinos in California, and they are, particularly getting screwed by this. But is there any political pushback in Canada, or Australia, or the U.S. to this?
Certainly in Australia there is, but what I would say is that the issue of affordability is largely confined to the largest capitals, and principally Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, and that's where the greatest immigration pressure is, and that's where also the greatest constraints on supply are, funnily enough. In some of the other regional cities, I've just done a study over the last 17 years, some of those cities have actually seen affordability relative to key worker incomes improve. And the reason for that is that, if you take one of those cities like Townsville, for example, there's more than adequate land supply. There's zoned available land that is not being developed because there's no market for it. So they've had weak demand and ample supply, and therefore the affordability equation has actually improved. The sad thing, I think, in Australia is that there's no general strategy of looking at how we can disperse population, make some of these regional cities more attractive, which means give them decent infrastructure, decent schools, decent hospitals and healthcare, decent public open space, and employment. But instead, we seem to be continually reinvesting, particularly into the inner parts of our major cities, that's where all the infrastructure money is being spent. So that's where people want to go, which is creating a hothouse problem, you know. So I think if you look at what can be done to fix it, I would suggest that putting all of the growth into 3 or 4 cities in a country the size of Australia is madness, number one. And I'd be looking to start with that.
Is there any pushback in Canada?
We're seeing, Joel, a movement away from the big cities to smaller rural communities in Canada. And again, lots of out-migration from Toronto and Vancouver. You know, it was funny, I was in Calgary last week and driving on the Trans-Canada Highway, lots of cars from Quebec and Ontario hitting to Alberta. And Alberta, of course, the economy's on fire. But you know, it was funny. We looked around Calgary, and there's lots going on there. But again, the issue is the big areas are losing people to the more affordable markets, and I think the issue again, as Ross says, is the immigration in Canada is very high, and it's coming into Toronto and Vancouver, which is again a part of the issue. But again, I think we need to zero in on, you know, we talked about magic wanding solutions to this. It's really about land use regulation, and I think immigration is a bit of an excuse here in Canada. Wouldn't you agree, Wendell?
Absolutely. And by the way, what's happening in both Canada and Australia, and I think to a lesser degree, perhaps in Canada and the United States, to a lesser degree, perhaps in Australia, I see there's huge migration going on out of the major metropolitan areas, the unaffordable metropolitan areas. The state of California, which managed to add 40 million people from statehood in 1850 to the late 2010s, is expected to be the same population 40 years from now as it is now. Growth has stopped completely. 3 million people have moved out of California net since 2000. And generally it is felt that it has to do with housing affordability. Portland and Seattle, which were among the fastest growing metropolitan areas in the United States, are now losing domestic migrants, largely because of housing affordability. So the solution, unfortunately, is people are deciding that they don't want to live in these places anymore. They're not going to go away, but the migration levels are unbelievable at this point.
But from a planning perspective, aren't we dealing with, and excuse the expression, an urban myth here, at least in the U.S., where the predominant supposition on the part of planners is that jobs are going to be available in densely packed urban areas. And what seems to be happening, especially as I read your work, Wendell, is that jobs, in fact, are being much further dispersed than ever before, and job growth in the suburban areas that have been historically less dense are growing much faster than those that are in the inner city. And now with the advent of remote work, that just exacerbates the situation.
And we're really not talking about suburban in the traditional sense. We're also talking about exurban, where it's now someplace where maybe you're 50 miles from or 70 miles from the major centers. But if you're only going into the office once a week, it's not a big deal.
But if you're an urban planner,
right,
and just think about this for a second, who creates policy? If an urban planner for an urban or a regional area is tasked with the responsibility of, okay, how do I lay out my area? How do I decide what areas are going to be used for what? Their vested interest is in being able to continue the growth, even though it's elusive or illusory, in those dense areas. And that seems to me to be the underlying assumption and the underlying myth that needs to be changed. What do you guys think of that?
Yeah. Well, Marshall, I think that's right, because there's a confusion, I think, widespread confusion amongst policymakers of all types, that cities are the built-up high-density cores, and they don't regard the suburbs or the exurbs, as you call them, as part of the metropolitan city area. So they do all of the planning. The capital investment is all centered around this idea that everyone must work in the inner city because that's where all the tall buildings are. It's the Emerald City thing and so on. But what's been happening here, and it's probably happening elsewhere, the great growth in jobs is being driven in a range of suburban areas, particularly around industries like education and health and allied health. The traditional office worker is a dying creature, right? Because AI was a whole bunch of things that are changing the way that sort of work is done and the productivity that can happen. So you don't have typing pools anymore. You don't have these legions of people commuting with their lunch into the CBD for their day at work and then commuting home. I mean, there are still people who do that. But what I think we fail to understand is that the economy has changed, and the way the economy is changing the dispersion of jobs and the way we should be planning our cities. We just haven't caught up with that reality yet.
But this is a lot bigger than Australia, Canada, and the United States. I mean, you look at urban planners; they have been suggesting these kinds of solutions, urban growth boundaries, green belts, that kind of thing, since the 1947 Town and Country Planning Act in the UK. The opposition to any sort of serious expansion of urban areas goes back more than a century. I was just writing something to the effect, quoting Ken Jackson of Columbia University, who's noted that the central city of Philadelphia, the urban core, began losing population, between 1800 and 1810. People don't like this, but what you've got, what has happened in urban planning is almost like a theology. Sprawl is bad, even though they don't know what sprawl is. By the way, they've never ever really well defined it, and that's what we're dealing with. It's a real ideological battle, unfortunately.
Well, I give a lecture to the university. Professor comes in, and I'm the let's say the contrarian, and I always make the point that, look, I have a cottage on the Winnipeg River, hour and a half outside of Winnipeg. We have Starlink, high-speed internet, and it's better than what I have in Winnipeg. So the technology is towards dispersion. Sorry, we're not having to be downtown. Remember that it was a walking city at one time, these sort of legacy downtown cores. There is no case for a downtown anymore. If I follow what you have written, Wendell.
Well, I would argue that probably what you're talking about is downtown will be another neighborhood, another job center among many job centers. And, Wendell, of course, is a native of Los Angeles, and I spent most of my life in Los Angeles. That was actually the model that LA developed, which we tried to get away from, which was a big mistake. But that what we're seeing, and I'm working on this right now, in many parts even of Southern California, we now have new mini downtowns closer to where people live. Are we seeing anything like that in Australia or Canada?
Yeah. Well, let's call them suburban business districts as opposed to central business districts, and that's exactly what is happening. Certainly in Sydney, you're starting to see that Parramatta is now a very large second city almost within the Sydney region. You're starting to see that emerge in Melbourne, places like Box Hill, for example. Quite often the growth is centered around a university campus as well. And in Brisbane, we're actually actively trying to plan for new suburban business districts, particularly in areas where former industrial land, for example, with a sawtooth shed where hundreds of people might have worked back in the day, which now the legacy land use zoning says it's industrial, but it can't be used for industry because industry's moved and doing different things. So it's now storing boxes. So, which is an inefficient use of land. So we're now looking at how to repurpose that land and create a mix of uses. But in the process, what's becoming evident to me is that this idea that density is a more efficient land use is really problematic, because we've now chosen a preferred planning approach, which is going up. But the difficulty there is that the cost of that is very expensive. I don't know what it's like over there, but we've looked just recently at taking a hypothetical school model. So a school in a new suburban area, which might only be 2 or 3 stories high, for example, the buildings, and then you've got a field, a football field, say, is the cheapest form of school you can deliver. If you want to deliver an infill school for the same school population, it might be a 10 or 12-story building. That can be several times more expensive to build. And that's not even taking into account the land, which is very hard to find. That's not taking into account the community objection, because no one wants a school in their neighborhood anymore, apparently because of all the cars and the traffic. So the infill idea and the density idea, it sounds nice in theory. It's very, it's loose, you know, it's tempting. But when you look at it in practice, you realize that we've actually chosen a model that is more difficult to do. It takes longer and it costs more.
Well, and you know, we've written extensively about this, and Wendell and I have collaborated on this as well. It is counterintuitive, right? When you talk to people and you say, look, on your cost per unit in a dense area is going to be higher than your cost per unit in a less dense area. It's because of the infrastructure that you have to bring in. It's because of the style of construction and the construction standards that you have to have in tall commercial buildings. And it is, as Ross says, several times, if not an order of magnitude more expensive to do that. So, but it's true. It is true. The thing that I think is fascinating is that the planners, if you were to go back to the sprawl argument, planners didn't want sprawl because it seemed bland and faceless. If you think of the original instances of sprawl, Sunrise Highway in Long Island, Ventura Boulevard in San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles, these were areas that had no urban center associated with them. They just had retail stores and houses kind of adjacent. That model has given way to much more of a village model. And I think that's what you mean when you talk about cities or suburban centroids.
Well,
right?
You have places like, I don't know, Peter and Ross, whether you've seen places like the Woodlands or even Irvine here in Southern California.
Yeah.
Those are very vibrant. Irvine, when you think about it, has short commutes, lots of people working at home, and has more parkland than virtually any major city.
Well, and I don't know to the degree to which this exists in Australia or in Canada, but the historic preservation of earlier villages from a previous, almost pre-industrial era that have now been resuscitated, and the urban core, if you want to call it that, the village core, has some charm to it. Is that a model that we're seeing in Canada and Australia?
You know, again, I was in Calgary last week, and there are these very charming, as you say, Joel, sort of sub-villages in Calgary. What's interesting about Calgary is there's a 35% office vacancy rate, and there's some big buildings there. And you know, again, the issue is that often these are large floor plates, which are very hard to convert into residential. So it's an issue. But again, Calgary has lots of vibrant little sub-communities, and they're very attractive, and they're actually very expensive, but very desirable. People are moving there, and you know, where my son lives in Bridgeland, basically a place is $1 million, just a regular house.
How about Australia, Ross?
So, same here. I think, Marshall, the village is being reborn. If you like, there's a new attraction to it. And I think that the accelerator on that was COVID, although I suspect it was happening long before COVID. But when people were sent home, and we had in this country some of the most ridiculous lockdowns anywhere in the world, but people were sent home, they rediscovered the convenience of having stuff nearby, you know, a local small supermarket rather than a big one, the local coffee shop or bistro. And if we can populate those villages with the other things that people need, which is, you know, access to work, access to education, access to healthcare, access to open space, you're going to see, I think, a real migration around these centres. Well, I hope we will, because then you start to create the opportunity for shorter commutes, because the idea of setting up large outlying dormitory areas and then putting all the jobs somewhere else, that's insane. You know, we're going to kill ourselves with congestion if that's what happened. And I know Alan Berger, I said, is out here this week, and he talks about mixed use not in the way that we traditionally do it by setting up blocks of uses around the place, but almost an atomization of uses so that they're sprinkled around like salt and pepper, which I think is a really attractive idea. But once again, these attractive ideas can be very difficult to do in practice.
Where is, just out of curiosity, it seems that there needs to be a wholesale change in the education of urban planners. Where does Wendell
I have to point out that one of the reasons we do what we do is there is no urban planning school at Chapman.
right. They can't cancel us from that. Exactly.
Because we would be canceled.
Right. But Wendell, you'd mentioned the Town and Country Act of 1947, 48 in England.
Yeah, right.
As providing the template for urban planners to think about how to plan things. Is there a similar kind of nexus for urban planning and manifesto around it?
Well, there are some things going on. Right now, there is a reform of the housing market in New Zealand going on. And by the way, one of the great players in this process is a former Frontier Center employee. Now I forgot it. What?
David Seymour.
Yeah, David Seymour, my old friend whose name slipped my mind anyway. Anyway, New Zealand really has put something together, and the key is going to be to deliver it in this period of 3 years that they have power. The National Party and the coalition with the Association of Consumers and Taxpayers. We hear, and I don't know if there's anything to it, believe it or not, out of the Labour government, the new Labour government that has just been elected in the UK, they're talking about major planning reforms. I don't know how serious they are, though, because there, as we've seen, is a real opposition to any peripheral expansion, that you will not deal with the housing costs unless you allow peripheral expansion. And there are a number of us have come up with ideas that are being suggested along the lines of new towns. At Chapman, we've published a couple of reports that suggest taking the interior of California, where housing affordability is bad, but not so nearly so bad as it is on the coast, and basically reducing the regulations and trying to make it more attractive to people and so on. Nobody's gone for that yet. And the thing that really concerns me, and if this sounds resentful, I'm sorry, but the planners have had power for a long time. This didn't start yesterday. Where have they been? This is one big problem, in my own view, is the public policy goal of housing is to house people, is to house them well. And that doesn't show anywhere except, in the theories that are never implemented.
Well, one of the things that to shift to some of the implications, as we did in the Latino study and now in the work that you do, is there seems to be also a class issue here. Other words, and an age issue. Other words, if you're of our generation, I would say most of us are in this.
We're legally dead.
We're legally dead, right. or soon to be dead. But the bottom line is we were able to get in before this regime really took power. And so if you bought your house in, I bought my first house in Hollywood in the 1980s for $150,000. I tell my students, they all fall on the floor like, it can't possibly be. You couldn't buy a closet in Hollywood for $150,000. So what I wonder about is, are we also creating a class and to some extent race, given that the younger population tends to be more diverse, and an age issue? I know in Australia there was even a proposal that you try to get rid of all the Australians who own homes after 67, that you're all supposed to move someplace else to make way, which this way they can deal
Plan
with
75.
the housing. Yeah. So what I'm wondering about is, has anyone talked about the sort of class and age issue related to housing? Because that seems to me to be one of the reasons why, for instance, we've had a great growth both on the left, which talks about public housing, and a great growth on the right, which wants something else than what we have now. Has anyone talked about what the class and age generational implications are?
Well, I think the age thing certainly is alive and well here, because boomers are now blamed for hogging the housing market, and part of that might be true, whereas the millennials are the ones that are clearly facing the greatest challenges. But I'll say that again, that's mainly in 3 large cities. It's not the case in some of our regional centres. So age is, but class is less so a political issue. I think it's there. I think key workers, nurses, firemen, police, aged care, childcare, these are the people who now face the greatest barriers to entering the housing market, and even renting is becoming problematic, chewing up a lot of their income. But that hasn't emerged as a political issue yet. I think if things keep going the way they are, it's going to become one for sure.
Well, I know when I've been looking at the polling for, because one of the great political issues in America, and I'd be curious whether this will take place in Canada as well, is that younger people are moving to the right, particularly younger males.
Yeah, absolutely.
And when you look at the issues they care about, it's inflation and housing. That's what they're really concerned with. Is there any kind of movement that's beginning to express itself in sort of class or generational lines to move people maybe right now to the right?
So Joel, we've seen the young people who voted for Justin Trudeau back in 2015, and en masse, they have now abandoned him. And the latest polls are showing the Trudeau Liberals falling to 3rd or 4th place. So you're going to see a huge convulsion here in Canada. When I bought my first house in the mid 80s, it was 43,000 Canadian. And I did want to mention here, we've been very lucky at Frontier we've worked with Wendell for 18 years now, Wendell. And one of the original people who worked on the Housing Affordability Index with Wendell was David Seymour, who is now going to be the Deputy Prime Minister of New Zealand. And his fingerprints are all over what is going on in New Zealand. And it's directly related to you, Wendell. So, a big feather in your cap.
So is it?
So here's the question,
okay.
though. You to get to your class issue,
right?
There's always been, real estate has always been a piece of the economy that has generated tremendous wealth and has defined the generational transfer of wealth to elites.
Right.
Right. And with our era of low interest rates, we saw a lot of shifting in the ownership of real estate, both residential and commercial. And we saw, for instance, a lot of pension funds and a lot of very, very institutionalized money,
investment banks,
getting into that business. So if we're witnessing a genuine falling apart of that centralization of real estate, doesn't that challenge the highest tier, the most elite tier of the economy first? Is that the reason why we're seeing resistance to change? Because of the fear that maybe it's all going to fall apart and institutionalized wealth is going to fall apart with it?
Well, look what's happened already with commercial real estate. I assume the same things are true in Toronto and in Sydney that we see in LA and New York and San Francisco. The same dynamic. And if it goes into housing, it will be pretty catastrophic for a lot of companies if housing values suddenly went down. But on the other hand, in some ways, maybe that would be better, even though I would be a big loser. It would be better if we got to a situation where the prices readjusted. Like, for instance, in a relatively unregulated market, like let's say in Texas, their prices are going down. I get these things. Oh, housing prices are down in Austin or Dallas. Isn't that horrible? I said, no, that's what should be happening. Think of the situation
right,
here.
creative destruction,
Right.
basically, right? And just to amplify your point, we're seeing a lot of bottom feeders
Right.
in the commercial real estate business. And with the institutionalization of single-family home ownership in large corporations, which I saw a statistic recently that said about 20% of the U.S. housing stock is owned by large entities, through REITs, through, they don't own each individual property, right? They own them in a collective, usually some kind of public entity. I wonder whether we're going to see some bottom feeding going on there if that market collapses.
I think we have to be careful not to make the usual mistake that American economists make when they completely misread what happened in 2008. We don't have a national housing market in the United States. We've got many local housing markets, and that's, of course, the same thing in Canada and Australia as well. The fact is that we have housing that is affordable in Indianapolis, in Cincinnati, in Texas, et cetera, where planning has not come in and imposed a legal framework that basically erects these barriers that raise the cost of land and create in those places incentives on the part of homeowners to never support any of this out of fear that they'll lose the money that they've got. And this is a very big problem. And so I don't see any likelihood ever that you're going to have a bust that's going to cause the problem. My big concern is in the 2/3 of the United States where there is still some hope, and the 1/3 of Canada where there's still some hope, that those places in Eastern Canada and the prairies and the Midwest and the South here, that those places, if they go and follow Portland and Seattle and California, the middle class will be finished, which is, by the way, what the OECD has expressed great concern about, because the same thing has gone on in Europe as well, as they followed the Pied Piper of the planners.
Yeah, well, Piketty and others have been making the point for a while. I mean, I know that his politics may not agree with the three of you, but he does make the point that we're really becoming a society where basically, if you want to live decently, you got to inherit money. You got to inherit houses. That the people who are who come in, who work hard, traditionally, made their own money, it's almost impossible for them to buy a house. So, I mean, the questions I think going to be over time is, are we going to essentially take away or reduce the enormous profits that people like me have made on my housing in order to create a better situation for the next generation? And of course, one of the things that bothers me a great deal is one solution is we're going to go into your neighborhood of single family homes and we're going to densify it. I remember Ross visiting Curran Guy in Sydney, and there was a lovely, lovely area. And all of a sudden, in the middle of single family homes, there are 6-story apartment buildings. I mean, is that going to be the proposed future?
No, it's not going to work. And the reason, it goes back to what I said before. I mean, the densification idea that we're going to break up large housing blocks into multiple, nice in theory because you've added to supply, but the cost of that new supply is high. To build vertical is a lot more than building a traditional low-rise family home. And the other problem with that theory is that we tax our new supply very heavily. We don't tax the existing stock. So if you trade a house here, we have a transfer duty. It's called a stamp duty, which is around about 3.5% of the price when you sell from one person to the next. That's for an established pre-existing home. You go to build a new home on a new titled piece of land, 30% of that price is taxes, charges, and regulations.
Wow.
30%. And 1/3 of all of that, 10%, is our national GST, goods and services tax, only applies to new housing. right? So that's collected by the federal government. It doesn't come back. It shouldn't be coming back into the housing sector to provide the infrastructure, but it doesn't. So then state and local governments step in and they add their own charges because they have to provide stuff, utilities and parks and libraries and swimming pools. So, we tax, and then we decide, we're going to be clever here. Let's improve the environmental performance of housing. We're going to introduce all these new building codes to make them more energy efficient and so on. But that, once again, only applies to new stock, only to new. All of the pre-existing houses are immune from that regulation. So it adds more cost to delivery of new stock. So building new stock, whether it's on the outlying fringe, and Wendell, the problem we've now got is we could flood the market with land. It won't make a lot of difference anymore because it's the cost of the new supply. We've got to untangle that regulation. And if you bring in new supply, whether it's apartment buildings or smaller townhouse styles, that is all heavily taxed. So I really don't know how we're going to walk our way back out of this mess.
Is the same situation in Canada?
In Canada, what we're seeing is the federal government is, and it's not its jurisdiction, but it's throwing around hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars, trying to bribe cities to densify, change building codes, and again, the issue is, that government will be gone soon. And again, I personally, I don't think the feds should be in that space. And, it is a bit of a mess, let's just say.
Well, Ross, you tripped on you hit the tripwire here with talking about environmental and green regulation.
Yeah.
Based on what you're saying, it seems like this is just another layer to add cost. But where do you think it's going? What will be the trends going forward in dialing in more environmentally friendly land use policies? Where do you think government will take that?
I think I can only see that there's going to be more efforts to regulate higher standards of environmental efficiency. And look, there's nothing wrong with that. This makes a lot of sense. If a more energy efficient house is going to be less expensive to run, but the upfront cost is something we've got to confront. We can't have a sensible discussion about the perils of housing affordability and locking out an entire generation when even building a starter home on the outskirts is now beyond the reach of young families. And at the same time, so we're really worried about that, but we're also worried about saving the planet. So we're going to impose all these extra costs of regulation just on you guys, because the people who are living in the inner city in the multi-million-dollar houses, they're all exempt because they got in first. So there's a real policy imbalance here. If you were really concerned about the energy efficiency of housing, you would introduce mandates that every homeowner had to comply with. But the risk there, of course, is that there's your political backlash because existing homeowners would say, oh, no, I'm not voting for you, you're gone. We get away with it. Because when you buy a new house or a new apartment, there's no separate ticket that says, here's your tax and regulatory bill. It's all built into the price. So people don't even know how much extra cost is being added.
But we're seeing green activist groups lobbying to, for example, which is crazy in Winnipeg or in Canada, ban natural gas furnaces. Like, are you kidding? This is a place that goes to -40 in the winter for a couple of months.
That's exactly.
Heat pumps don't work at past -25. I'm sorry.
Yeah, we've got the same thing here, Peter. It's madness. Gas, natural gas. We export the natural gas all over the world, and now it's being mandated out of new buildings. They're all going through this induction houses. This is now a building mandate. You can't have a new, as I understand it, no new housing with natural gas for cooking or heating, or for hot water. It all now has to be electric, and your cooktops are all now going to be induction. Now, that's nice theory, but you've got all of your existing pots and pans and stuff. You got to chuck all that out because you've got to get special stuff for the induction. So it's another cost.
Well, and not to mention the fact that now you're going to mandate that electricity is being generated through green means. So your cost per kilowatt hour goes, from 8 cents to 30 cents.
Yeah.
So it
And
poses
I
yet
think
another
the-
cost on the
the-
homeowner.
The great, I mean, there's nothing new about this, of course, but the people who support and come up with these policies are the ones who are the most able to afford them. And so you see the high income earning professional classes, what you wrote about, Joel, the new oligarchs are the ones with all the money. They're the ones who are pushing for these policies. The people who are suffering the most are the ones least able to afford them. And they probably don't even realize that this is what's making their new house or their new apartment so much more expensive than it needs be.
Well, I just want to, just to sort of wrap up, because this has been a great discussion, but I think, I want to get into one more issue, which is the impact on demographics. Wendell's been doing a lot on this recently. We've been looking at why are some areas having incredibly low birth rates, because it's almost as if we create a situation where we make it impossible for young people to get a house in which they want to raise a family. And so that our solution is to bring in huge numbers of immigrants who, are coming from places where they're used to living in sort of bad conditions. So we sort of leveling everything down. But the birth rates are dropping in Australia, in Canada, in the United States. Do you think this is something that is part of the policy agenda? I remember doing a seminar in Berkeley, California, and a guy from the city of Oakland said, well, we don't need single-family homes because nobody has kids anymore, which he said, hopefully.
There's no question that there's a connection between insufficient housing and low fertility rates. There's all sorts of evidence on that. It came out of East Asia 10, 15 years ago. It's coming into the States now, Europe, etc. It's unbelievable. And so yes, and we're going to see a lot more research like that as well.
Are you seeing this in Canada and Australia as well?
Absolutely.
So,
Well, the same here. I think, Australia, Joel, as you would know, has always been an immigrant nation.
Right.
And, we've had waves of, well, first of all, the white fellas, of course, and then we had post-war migrants from Europe. We've had migration waves from southern Vietnam. We're now having them from African countries. So there's nothing new about Australian immigration, but what has happened is that our rate of natural growth has declined, and young people are certainly they're delaying having families, or they're having fewer children. And we had famously, our federal treasurer a few years ago, Peter Costello, said, have one for mum, have one for dad, and one for your country. But that's fallen away. So the numbers are coming right back. And we're reliant now entirely on immigration for population growth. And the challenge there is that not just the numbers that are coming in, but new arrivals are also more dependent on social services. They don't have private health care. They don't send their kids to private education. They don't have the money to buy, a battery electric vehicle, a Tesla or something. So they're placing a greater strain in the early years of their arrival on the economy than might otherwise be the case. So, yeah, it's a difficulty.
And they're inflating the rents, of course. So the rental market's being really badly hit here.
And of course, one of the great ironies is they count on the immigrants, but what we're finding is one of the biggest sources of slowdown in population growth in the United States, particularly in places like California, is that, immigrants from Latin America come here and they say, I can't afford to have children here because the housing's too expensive.
Right. So their birth rate mimics the rest of the country's
their birth rate has gone down too. So,
right.
I mean, you're really in a terrible conundrum in which essentially you have to keep importing people constantly because you can't replace your population, including from your own immigrants.
But, it's interesting to contrast that with countries that have relatively closed borders and closed societies. Take China and Japan as examples, where they have historically relied most heavily on natural birth rate as opposed to immigration. And the demographic, the population estimates long-term for China and Japan are devastating. I mean, they're talking about hollowing out Japan dramatically over the next 50 years, and China could lose as much as 500 million people in the next 50 years. So, that's the flip side of immigration. I guess net from the world, it looks like if housing prices are going up everywhere, we're probably going to be in for a lot more of this.
So just to wrap up, I'd like to ask the three of you, what do you think is going to happen in housing? And is there any policy that could be adopted that could reverse this situation? Maybe we'll start with you, Ross.
Well, as I said, I think we've got to understand that, it's not just a supply issue, that there's a demand issue as well. And the narrative in this country of late has been that it's all about supply. And that is certainly part of the problem. We need to understand what's driving the cost of supply up needlessly, and how it's an unfair, very distortionate tax system on the supply end. But we've also got to understand on the demand side that through immigration, we've got to moderate that to a level we can cope with. It's a bit like driving through a school zone at 100. You wouldn't do it. You're going too fast. But there's a sensible speed that you can do it. So you can't have a regulatory system like we've got, which is slow and cumbersome and unresponsive and expensive, and at the same time accelerate your growth. And we're seeing the collateral damage of that now. What's going to happen? Well, I think the demand side, the pressure is going to come off. We're going to slow that down, I hope. And on the supply side, I just wish we get some common sense in the policy formation area, but I'm not hopeful.
Peter?
I think we're going to continue to see the mass immigration or migration between areas from high cost to low cost. It is a big issue for all the politicians, but I think they're still missing the point that it's really about, as Ross says, overregulation and so on. The incoming prime minister, if it's going to be Pierre Poilievre, he keeps talking about getting rid of the gatekeepers, which sort of is hopeful in the sense that gatekeepers is a signal of control, political control, too much regulation. So I think the apple is turning slowly, but too slowly.
And Wendell, last thought from you.
Again, sort of echoing both of our friends from overseas and across the border. My sense is we've got a lot of places in the United States where they think densification is the answer, and they've convinced all the kids, as it were, younger generations, that the answer is putting more houses on the same lots, densification. It is not the answer. People are moving away, and I don't see any serious way that the markets that are out of control in the United States are going to be able to recover. That's why it's so crucial that we retain the ones we've got. But it is different. One hopes that when they finally realize that the densification doesn't work, maybe we'll begin to do something that works. But that's decades away, I fear.
Well, gentlemen, what a fascinating conversation. This is really interesting. It's a little depressing to think that there is no magic bullet and there's no policy agenda that could instantly fix the problem. But, as with the rest of life, we'll just have to deal with the unintended consequences of previous decisions. Thank you so much for being with us on the Feudal Future podcast, and we hope that you can join us again soon.
Great pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
The feudal future.